Deputy Chief Executive of Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming. I manage Sustain's team on working on sustainable food places and helped to establish the network with Tom Andrews and many others back in the dark ages. So yeah, it's really great to see you all on this call. Big thanks to Ren for pulling this together so swiftly. I'm going to be chairing this session. I've been working with Ren on the sort of economy element of our work. So hopefully in advance of this, you'll have read Ren's blog and some of the extra information that she sent around. Ren, I mean, if you're able to paste those links as a reminder in the chat, that would be fantastic. As a way of reminder on what we're going to be talking about over the next hour and 15 minutes. So this session is going to be providing food partnerships with an oversight of the recent funding that the government has announced in early March. So things like the Community Renewal Fund, Community Ownership Fund, Towns Fund, Levelling Up Fund. And the session is going to help give a better idea of which of these funds may be relevant to you, to your local areas. And also we're going to be hearing from some examples of the kind of things that might appeal to their remit, the sort of things that maybe we could be focusing in on as applications. For the bulk of these, it'll be crucial for you to develop relationships with the relevant lead, bulk of these funds, to develop relationships with the relevant leads in your local authority. Some of you on this call may well be those leads. Indeed, there's probably folks on this call who are better informed than some of us speaking. So, so as ever in the spirit of Sustainable Food Places community, we hope that you'll use the chat box and the time for questions to share your thoughts and your expertise. I understand that we've got some new faces to Sustainable Food Places on this call. I've opted not to do I've been encouraged not to do the 10-minute slide with the sort of full introduction to what Sustainable Food Places is. You'll be pleased to know. Suffice to say, for those who aren't familiar with this, Sustainable Food Places is a network of local partnerships with a place-based focus on food. And the two main criteria that I think sort of are fundamental to all of these partnerships are, firstly, a partnership approach, i.e. that you include all the relevant stakeholders working on food systems in that location. So that would be bringing together public, private, community and third sector organisations. And secondly, that there is that true breadth of vision, that it covers the whole range of food issues that will be relevant at that local level, in food poverty and healthy food, tackling junk food, supporting food enterprises, focusing on food procurement, issues around food waste and climate footprint, community food skills, much more. And this is covered in Sustainable Food Places' six key issues, i.e. things that seem to be common to all of those partnerships. This is a page on our website. If you have a chance to sort of post a link to that, that would be great, or otherwise I'll do so in a second. Many of you will be familiar with that. So we're not actually going to be hearing much from the partnerships today. This session is more for the partnerships. And we brought together some excellent speakers. Firstly, we're going to have Susie and Jenny from Power to Change. Then we're going to be hearing from Iain at the Bevy, followed by Richard from Pembroke House, and Guy McQueen from Lewes Council. I'm going to be doing proper introductions as and when we run through those. Before I do that, I just wanted to do some housekeeping. So we're going to be recording this session and hoping to share it with the Sustainable Food Places Network. I think that's right, Ren. If you have useful links or comments, or you're having any technical issues, please do put something in the chat box. If you have any questions for the speakers, please add them to the chat. We are going to have, I forgot to mention, we do actually have 2 slots for questions for Q&A. Firstly, after the first 2 speakers, and then at the end, after the second 2 speakers. So please add any questions into the chat. When it comes to those 2 slots, I'll either read out the questions or invite you to come in and ask the question. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ren, who's going to be kicking things off. Of course, I didn't introduce Ren on this, to give a bit of an overview as to what all these funds are. Ren, are you ready to go?
Ready to go, yeah. Hi everyone, great turnout, nice to see you all here. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. If my computer will let me share. Can everyone see that? Can you give me a nod, Ben? I can only see your face. Brilliant. Okay, quick agenda, but that will be, then we'll cover that in due course. I just wanted to spend a few minutes to kind of give you an overview of sort of why we're running this session. So Rishi Sunak announced his most recent budget in early March, and within that he released several funds where he was kind of speaking our language, kind of community-led, place-based, locally led, and my ears pricked slightly. So I did a bit of reading on what these funds are, and this is just basically an overview. So just to kind of a preface that I'm in no way an expert. Some of you will know more than me, but I just thought it would be really useful to kind of make sure that they're on your agenda. So there were 4 funds: a community ownership, community renewal fund, levelling up fund, and the towns fund. I'm just going to whiz through them quickly just so that you know about them, but I've got more information in my blog and that kind of extra document which I've shared in the chat. So the Community Renewal Fund, this is a £220 million fund, and this is where I think we've got potential as food partnerships to really influence kind of and get sustainable food agenda into kind of local authorities. So this fund is where local areas can access up to £3 million of funding. 100 areas have been kind of identified as key areas based on various indices, but all areas can apply. And the bidding actually comes from local stakeholders. So there's an expectation it will come from universities, voluntary, third sector, business, or local authorities themselves, just with a kind of remit that their bids don't just further the needs of that business or charity, that it's supporting the community as a whole. It will work slightly differently in Northern Ireland, where bids will go directly to central government rather than local government. So kind of the reason why I put on this session so quickly is because most local authorities will have a deadline for mid-May for these bids. And so I wanted to make sure there's an opportunity for any food partnerships who are interested to kind of get their head around this and put a bid in, because the local authority will have a deadline of 18th of June to central government. The fund itself is to trial the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which will come in next year to replace the ESIF EU funding. And the idea is that places will pilot innovative projects to invest in skills, community in place, local business, and supporting people into employment. And for me, in that food bubble, I think food ticks all of those boxes, and there's real scope here for local areas to invest in upskilling people in various food sectors, investing in kind of community assets, local food businesses, and supporting people to get into the food sector, as it's one of 1 in 7 people in the UK work in the food sector. So it will work differently in each area. It's worth just going and checking your local authority website. They'll have an open bidding process, so there will be information on the website. And successful bids are most likely to align with existing local plans, local needs. So again, food partnerships should be aware of what is likely to be successful in that area. And there's a real focus on sort of net zero, low carbon. So very quick funding. The successful pilots will be selected late July. Money will come in, filtered through local authorities, and that money needs to be spent by March 2022. So it's quite a quick turnaround, but definitely one to keep your eye on and kind of explore further. So the next 2 funds I'm going to chat about are larger scale funds. So it's kind of, it's just good to know about, but it's likely for the Levelling Up Fund, which is a 4.8 billion fund, that there will kind of be oven ready projects that local authorities will be putting forward to central government. So the Levelling Up Fund, again, part of this Build Back Better agenda, is a large investment opportunity for capital investment in things like transport, regeneration of town centres, cultural investment. So again, real opportunities here for food, regeneration of brownfield sites for maybe new market spaces or peri-urban farms, or cultural investment if there is existing orchards or vineyards or mills. There's a chance here to invest in those and help to make them more sustainable. So with this Levelling Up Fund, it's likely local authorities will have kind of projects ready, but there is a possibility here you might be able to weave sustainable food agendas into those projects. Each local authority can submit 1 bid per MP in their region, and each MP can also write a letter of support per bid. So again, another area of influence here is to find out what bids are going forward and then influence your MP in terms of the decision where they would like to support projects. So again, very quick turnaround, also deadline for 18th of June. So it's just really worth seeing what's happening in your area, what kind of bids are going into access the Levelling Up Fund. Same thing with the priority areas. 123 areas have been identified, but everyone can apply. It's just those local authorities will have access to extra funding to support with resources and bid collation. Towns Fund is one which actually came in 2019. 101 towns were selected to receive 25 million, and 45 towns were selected in early March to put their investment into place. So each town was asked to put together a towns deal board, which was a kind of a multi-sector board to decide what investment plan they would like to draw up. So obviously that's already been drawn up, but where, as I understand it, where you have a chance to influence is they will now be trying to put into play business strategy, so actually delivering this investment plan. So they'll be seeking local stakeholders to deliver these projects, but also support with the business plan. So there's potentially an opportunity here to make sure that, for example, maybe food hubs are in the plan, or support with same thing, regeneration, creation of market spaces, planning for spaces to support food enterprises, upskilling, connecting different food enterprises via kind of online hubs. Check out the blog, there are lots more ideas. And then the final fund, I'm not going to dwell on too much because Susie and Jenny and Iain will cover it more, but the Community Ownership Fund is a £150 million fund to support local community groups to take over assets. So there's each community group can access up to £250,000 match funded money to take over local assets through community ownership. And this is a great way to strengthen local infrastructure and promote social cohesion, boost the economy through owning these assets, particularly food enterprises. And again, mid-June is when the applications open. It will be a rolling application process, but more information will come out on the 18th of June. So I'll send around any information that I come across. The only thing to know is the community groups must have formal governances in place. And then kind of finally, why food partnerships? I think I'm preaching to the choir here. It's the cross-sector. Food and farming is one of the biggest industries, but we really need to make it sustainable as we build that better. Food partnerships have a lot of existing work, that's already happening. So can we kind of help fund it, kind of showcase the work that's already going on, and the things that they're picking up, skills, jobs, community place, culture, investment. Again, I feel like food ticks all of those boxes. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I'll hand back over to Ben.
Thanks, Ren. Yeah, that was whistle stop, but really comprehensive as well. I think a really good introduction to the topics and the speakers for the day. I'd like to introduce Jenny Sansom and Susie Finlayson from Power to Change, who are up next. So Power to Change is a trust which supports the development of community businesses in order to revive local assets, protect services people rely on, and address local needs. They support many food-related community businesses, including cafes, pubs, markets, and community gardens across England. And that vision of Power to Change is to create better places through community businesses. But Jenny and Susie will be able to do a much better job of telling you more about that. Jenny and Susie, can I hand over to you?
Hello. Hi, everyone. Jenny is going to share the slides.
Great, how's that? Have you got the slides up on your screen, guys?
We can see them, but I think you need to go to slideshow so that it plays and goes full screen.
Oh, yes, okay, yeah, hold on. Yeah, got you. Okay, go ahead.
Great. Yes, so Ben has given a pretty comprehensive intro, actually, and thanks, Ben, for that. So yeah, we're from Power to Change. We can jump forward a couple of slides, Jenny, I think. So we're going to start just talking through a bit about what Power to Change is, what community businesses are from our perspective, a few examples of kind of food-related community businesses, and then talk about kind of support that's available, and as has been covered a little bit, about Community Ownership Fund. So we are the National Trust to support community businesses in England. We were set up in 2015, and we believe in better places through community businesses. So community businesses are locally rooted. They're really place-based. they're led and accountable in some way to their local community. Crucially, they trade. So that can be goods and or services, including kind of contracts and commissions. And any surplus generated from that is reinvested into the local community. So they can be anything from kind of pubs and libraries. We've supported a lobster hatchery. So there's all sorts of things they can be. There's really no one thing they are. There's quite a few that are kind of traditional community hubs, but as I say, a whole range of different things. And one of the crucial aspects is this real accountability to the community. So the community has a real say in what happens, what services they deliver, what activities they do, how the organisation is run. And Iain will definitely give you much more of a flavour of that in reality, I'm sure, when he starts talking about the Bevy. We can jump to the next slide, Jenny. And the next one, because I just talked about it. So the impacts, as I say, they can be any kind of sector and any kind of organisation, but they have this range of impacts to the local community. So they reduce isolation, they improve health and wellbeing by bringing people together, delivering activities that can be kind of addressing mental health, it can be addressing physical health in many ways, depending on the activities they deliver. They improve community cohesion, they empower this kind of greater community pride, and often are focused on improving the local environment, the kind of local physical environment as well. They provide access to services, but also there's a lot of them deliver volunteering and training and routes to employment as well for people within their local community. Next one, there's currently over 11,000 in England and growing. There's over almost 150,000 volunteers involved in them in any one year, so it's getting quite sizable. And I think in terms of the asset ownership that is probably quite relevant to the Community Ownership Fund, there's £870 million worth of assets in ownership in the community business market. And the Community Ownership Fund is really aimed at trying to bring more of those assets into community ownership. And those are really crucial because they provide a kind of real sustainability arm for organisations. It's been challenged during COVID because they've not been able to function in a way they normally would with assets in terms of having people in and renting space and delivering activities in that way. But under normal circumstances, that asset ownership really increases the sustainability of organisations. That's where we really hope that the Community Ownership Fund will help really kind of support the sector to thrive. So yes, next slide, Jenny. Thank you. So yeah, as I say, there's over 11,000 in England, and of our support that we put out, over 60% of the support we put into the sector goes into areas that are in the 30% statistically most deprived. So we're really trying to support them, but that's also where they're located. So they're really trying to support and improve their areas. And it's kind of not the myth of affluent people coming together to save the pub, although that does happen. But as Iain will describe again, it's not always in really affluent and areas described going through those saving the pubs. But to give you more of a flavour of what are kind of the food related organisations that we've supported, Jenny is going to talk you through some examples, and I will come back to you, Vivian, in the chat.
Lovely. Okay, thanks very much, Susie. Okay, so, I suppose what I'm going to touch on is just a few examples of, in the real world, what do food and farming organisations look like as community businesses? So so we're going to start by looking at a food co-op. So Falmouth Food Co-op began as a small buying group for good food at wholesale prices, began as a group of friends, but then gradually got more and more members and more suppliers. And kind of became a more official organisation. And the aim of Falmouth Food Co-op is to make good food available to everyone, and in particular to support local non-industrial farmers. Prior to COVID, they were running regular community feasts to bring people together and make good food available to everyone. But during COVID, they had to pivot quite quickly to offer a different service, which was meals delivery. So they're now running a pretty extensive meal delivery service alongside a weekly veg box scheme. And so that's an example of how a community business can take the form of a food co-op. And so their legal form is a community interest company with a cooperative structure. So Falmouth Food Co-op were beneficiaries of Power to Change funding in 2020 under our Trade Up programme. Okay, so Okay, so now thinking about care farms, that's another form that community businesses can take in the food sector. So we'll look at Suffolk Befriending Scheme, and for 30 years, Suffolk Befriending Scheme have been providing services for vulnerable people, in particular those with learning difficulties. And they've been doing that in the form of drop-in centres. So drop-in centres to support people with learning difficulties with various activities. And they were looking to expand, and they consulted their service users who said that they wanted a sense of purpose, who said that they loved working outdoors, working with animals, they wanted to make social connections, and a farm seemed to be something that would tick all those boxes. So recently they set up a care farm which provides not only services and supported activities for people with learning difficulties, but also volunteering opportunities for other people, other local people. And it's got a huge positive impact in terms of the well-being and the skills and the health benefits that those participants get from taking part in the project, and also a positive environmental impact as well. And the income, the way they generate their income is mostly through personal budgets, although they have other smaller sources of income as well. Okay, so another form of community food business is community gardens, and we've got one in Bristol up in Knoll called Red Catch Community Garden. And they were established in 2017 and made use of a 2-acre old bowling green. And so their overall vision is to provide a connected, healthy and communal space that is welcoming to all. There's a big emphasis on food growing, but there's also a big emphasis on activity and enjoying the space and learning as well. And so they offer a lot of family and community-based activities around gardening, around food production and crafts. Some of those are for children, families, and some of them are for adults. So for example, there's everyday healthy options and kind of gardening related courses and talks and things for adults. They've got 25 volunteers who contribute regularly, although they've got over 60 of them on the books. They employ a part-time head gardener, and they also earn income through trading, through their cafe, through hiring their site out and running activities on the site. And also they've got an on-site shop that sells fresh fruit and vegetables and also homemade produce like chutneys and jams and honey and things like that. So that's community gardens. And also, I guess, a community-supported agriculture. So we've got here as an example of CSA, Sutton Community Farm, who were established in 2010 as a community benefit society. They've got a 7.1 acre smallholding, which they operate from. And they aim to produce healthy, sustainable food, as well as giving participants an opportunity to cultivate skills, get exercise and make friends. So really trying to involve people in as many ways as possible with food production. They provide a veg box scheme and they also supply restaurants in London. So Power to Change supported Sutton Community Farm through our Community Shares Booster programme in 2017, which means that we matched the funding that they raised through their own community share offer. And and following their community share offer, they now have 400 member shareholders, it's more than that, it's more than 400 member shareholders. So, and members are entitled to a 5% discount on a veggie box. They're invited to members only events, and they can crucially have a say in how the farm is run through taking part regularly in activities, but also through the AGM. So there are some examples of how community food businesses look in practice. Back over to Susie.
Okay, great, thanks Jenny. I think the other thing just to add on to that is community businesses don't have a single legal structure. There's not one legal structure that makes them a community business. They can be anything. If they want to run a community share offer, they have to be a community benefit society. But other than that, there's no kind of formal legal structure. They don't have to be registered charities, so it can kind of be everything and anything within that. So we're just going to talk a bit through the funding and support that's available at the minute. So we can jump forward, Jenny. So there's a whole range of different funding options. So capital and revenue, so kind of the big, back one, capital and revenue funding. So this can be things for kind of purchasing assets or renovating assets and buying equipment through to the kind of the project development and delivery. There are different models of that, so it doesn't all have to be grant. The great thing about community businesses and them trading and generating income is they can access repayable finance. So some different types of community businesses are more set up for that, will be generating greater income. So we'll be able to generate that kind of repayable finance and take on repayable finance to be able to kind of service loans. We've also worked quite a bit around blended finance. So this is part grant, part loan. So in effect, that slightly de-risks the investment for the investors. They're putting in a chunk of it as grant, knowing that won't come back, but that de-risks the loan element. We've talked a bit about community shares, and happy to share links around that in a bit. And they're done on a kind of one shareholder, one vote, rather than one share, one vote. So one member, one vote. So it's really kind of, there's a lot of equality across the democracy of that. Obviously crowdfunders, which I'm sure you're already aware of, and then they generate income through public sector contracts and other kind of contracts as well. And as Jenny said, for food organisations, there's a whole range of different markets that are open there for selling their goods and services into. The support is available from us at the minute. We've got Powering Up, which is a capacity strengthening programme for community businesses that have been negatively impacted by COVID-19. That's a real kind of support mechanism to try and help organisations weather the storm. It's support, not finance. We've got Community Business Crowd Match, which is up to £10,000. If you launch a crowdfunder, we can match up to £10,000 of that if you're successful in it. And then Community Business Reboost. So Jenny's described how Sutton Hill used Community Booster, but this is up to 25k to match support around share offers if people want to do a share offer in light of COVID, in response to COVID. I'll talk a bit more in a minute about mycommunity.org.uk. And loosely, you can go and look at our Renewal Initiative support, which has been how we've been trying to help the sector come back from the impact of COVID-19 and kind of weather the storms that have been thrown up through that. I'm going to hand quickly back to Jenny to talk a little bit about a specific programme as well. You're on mute.
Couldn't take part in a funding webinar for food programmes without mentioning LEAP, which is Loans for Enlightened Agriculture. So Google it, have a look at the Real Farming Trust website, Loans for Enlightened Agriculture, and there are unsecured loans available for a 5-year term between 20,000 and 100,000 at a rate of 5% interest. We're running short of time, so I shan't go into much more detail than that. But yeah, if you are an early stage food and farming organisation which would benefit from a loan, do look them up.
And then yes, so there's a shall I crack on? Yeah. There's a website called mycommunity.org.uk, which houses a whole range of tools from, I think it's 12 different organisations, including ourselves, that basically put all of our resources in one place to try and make it as easy as possible for organisations that are kind of starting out or wanting to change or try new things to navigate and find the information that's out there. And hopefully that's really useful. And then talking briefly about the Community Ownership Fund, probably more briefly than we planned on. Yeah, I think as Ren's described, we're really hopeful this could be quite transformative. It was included in the manifesto and it's come through in the budget, which is brilliant. We've been working with a whole range of other organisations to push for it to come through in the budget. So we're really glad that it's there. And it has real potential. We're working in the background with others to influence the government around what it actually will look like, because we know it's going to happen. We don't know exactly what it's going to be like in reality. So we're working with others based on the insight we gathered from the broad sector to try and make it more flexible to meet the needs of the sector around the kind of match funding that might be available in it, raising the maximum grant, because 250,000 won't necessarily buy some kind of real transformational asset purchases. From our experience, it's not actually quite enough to do some of that. And to provide organisations with some revenue and feasibility support as well as just capital, because I think as anyone involved in community stuff will know, the capital's great, but unless you've got people to kind of deliver it and support it, it's quite tricky. So we're working in the background on that, but we don't know any more really than anyone else on how it's actually going to be delivered in practice, except that we're kind of really happy that it's there. But sorry if we've gone a little bit over, and please keep chucking questions in the chat and we'll come back to you.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you, Jenny. And so sorry to rush you. I think it feels like a fantastic opportunity for food enterprises, community enterprises, but equally, I think relevant to so many partnerships out there. We definitely need to come back to you and see how we can work together and work with the network. Yeah, be great to hear ideas from those present about how we can maybe work together more in the future and do more stuff together. I'm going to hand over now to Iain. So Iain Chambers is the community manager of the Bevy, community-owned pub based in Brighton. I'm I'm going to skip the big introduction and just hand straight over to you, Iain. Otherwise, I'll just repeat what you're probably going to say.
Thanks very much. Hope everyone can hear me. Yeah, so I'll crack on. I'm Iain Chambers. I think I'm probably the only community manager of a pub in the UK. I used to be the general manager of the pub, but we do so much that we had to split roles up to cover everything that we do. And I'm actually involved with the Bevy because of community business structures, which is quite geeky of me. But yeah, I became involved with the Bevy because I was involved locally with my, we bought a church hall as a community. We bought our local church hall to prevent it from being houses. And somebody called Dave Boyle, who's an expert on community shares, is a good person to know, advised the Bevy people who were just starting to talk to us because we were a little bit further down the road of being a community benefit society. And they hooked me in. They're very persuasive and fun people to be with. And I was fascinated by the possibilities of what the Bevy, of what ownership of your own assets could do, and particularly in a low income area. So the Bevy was it was built in 1937 as part of a big garden estate. So there's two huge estates, and the Bevy sort of sits in the middle of the two estates. It ran as a sort of perfectly good community pub, quite focused, well loved, well used, and up until about the 90s was an exemplar of what a pub can do for a community without needing to be a community owned. But it lost its way and it was closed by the police and the local authority in 2010 for basically being an antisocial pub. Had a terrible reputation. It smeared the reputation of the estate as a whole, and everyone was pretty glad it was closing. The only problem was it was the last pub on the estate. All the other pubs had closed down, been turned into various things, or become accommodation, and so you had an estate, two estates of 18,000 people face the prospect of having no pubs. So if you just think of that, that's like having a town of 18,000 people with no pubs, which is quite remarkable, really. So local people got together. They persuaded the landlord to give them a chance to turn it back into a pub. The whole pub had been gutted. Everything had been removed: the floor, the ceilings, the walls, the electrics, the plumbing, the bar. It was a shell, and it was thought that it was going to become like a convenience store or something. But the landlord is a CIC itself, Community Interest Company itself, and allowed the locals time to turn it back into a pub. And it was quite remarkable that they managed to do that. They raised about £50,000–60,000 locally from about 700 shareholders. The share offer was £10 per share. That's a very low amount in any community share offer, probably the lowest essentially you can do. And the reason they did that was because they wanted the organisers wanted everyone to be involved and not have that barrier of wealth stopping you getting involved in that pub. And that meant that for a long time, the Bevy had the largest number of shareholders of any community-owned pub in the country. We don't own the pub. We used all the money to restore the ground floor of the pub. And so we own the business, but our landlord has similar aims to us. So we act in sync to benefit the community. We do sort of anything and everything, and all that flows from the local community. So they bring their ideas forward, and we very rarely say a blank no, unless it's a pretty antisocial thing. So we've had shampoo making from collecting dandelions in the street. We work with Park Run. We do adult education classes. We do free cookery classes for kids and families. We run academic talks in conjunction with the local university. We run a job club, and when COVID came along, we were already making social lunches in the pub. So obviously people came in and sat down together, and we had a very successful collaborations with local organisations, which we sort of stimulated to become organisations and fund themselves and become a thing in themselves, rather than always have to find funding for the pub. And And then when COVID struck, we closed even before we were ordered to close, because we knew that people had become somewhat reliant on the social lunches that we served in the pub, and those people will all be shielding, and we knew immediately they faced a lot of problems in just eating. So that we started Bevy Meals on Wheels, and we've served over 8,000 meals through COVID. We also got together with our local secondary school and used their facilities to cook and chill or freeze another 4,000 meals. They were all given out for free. And the meals that the pub distributed are all based on ability to pay. You don't have to pay, but you're welcome to pay if you want to. The pub's very committed. We realised very quickly that food is very important in the community, and the food injustice is very strong in that community. It has some very, very deprived areas, bottom 2% in the country. And so we had a particular day where it was really opened up to us. We ran a big party, a street party. We closed the road. We had over 500 people came to the pub, and we noticed that we were seeing people we'd never seen before. We realised it was because we provided free food, and that was a real penny dropped to say, wow, there's people who can't use this pub, even though we're very cheap for Brighton and all our food is reasonably priced, but there's some people who just can't access it. And ever since then, we've made every effort to run events and put kind of access to good, wholesome food at the sort of centre of what we do. Just in terms of funding, that initial funding paid for the revamp of the pub. We were very excited, and we opened the pub. So we raised about £50,000-60,000 locally, and that unlocked grants of about £140,000, non-repayable grants. But as soon as we opened, we realised actually the pub was so unpopular before that we actually weren't going to hit our performance targets in terms of income, and we ran into financial difficulties. And that's when we went back to Power to Change, who'd started and said, "Is there any chance you can help us?" And they were immensely helpful, and we got £175,000 grant, which helped the business sort of complete the job of opening, and have applied to pretty much every Power to Change initiative funding grant ever since. So it's a really interesting business, and we've contributed nationally, and we're very keen, particularly in the Community Ownership Fund, that the metric or the kind of multiple that is used is created so there is access for people in low-income areas. So the Bevy's kind of ratio, if you like, was about 15% raised from local people, 85% raised from other sources, mainly grants. We're worried that if the Community Ownership Fund is a match fund, that unless you can find a way of adding grants into the community's match, you'll probably have real problems, particularly in the south of England, being able to buy pubs that cost £500,000-600,000. That's before you even start doing it up. So it's a real challenge, but it's a wonderful business. Community Benefit Society is a really powerful way of giving power and involvement and purpose to the local community. So I highly recommend looking at that format. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Iain. We're running over ever so slightly, and what I was hoping to do is to move straight on to the next couple of speakers, then take all the questions at the end. Are you going to still be around at sort of 10 past 11, 5 past 11? That would be fantastic. Yeah. Really, really inspiring business or enterprise. I'd like to hand over to Richard. Richard's from Pembroke House, which is a social action centre in Walworth, South London. And Pembroke House has worked with local partners to become one of Southwark's community food hubs, supplying emergency food in the past year, and are now focused on community wealth building to lead a long-term neighbourhood approach to tackling food insecurity. And then they're building their partnerships through the London's Food Routes Incubator Programme, where projects include a new social enterprise in Elephant Park, focused on job creation in the hospitality sector for those most impacted by the pandemic, along with a community kitchen, a neighbourhood cafe, which tests new approaches to service delivery with a social space at its core. Richard, are you there? Are you ready? Can I hand over to you?
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to share my screen. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
start from the beginning rather than the end, I think would be good. Okay, I'm going to try and do this 7 or 8 minutes. So excuse me if I skip through a bit. I guess we're a partnership, I mean, compared to Iain, that is in sort of much earlier stages. So what I'm going to be talking about is some of the work that we did prior to COVID and during COVID to kind of get us into the position where we think we have a kind of a direction and a vision and sense of purpose, but a lot more work to be done. So yeah, work for an organisation called Pembroke House, which has been in Walworth in South London since 1885. So originally part of the kind of settlement movement, started by students from Oxford, from Cambridge University, who were kind of concerned about growing inequalities in the inner city areas and interested in sort of testing new ways of working very much embedded in the community. Obviously now that feels very different, that kind of work, but there's some of the original ethos about the kind of neighbourhood scale that we work at, which is still quite relevant today. And just prior to COVID, we'd opened this second site called the Walworth Living Room, funded by Guys and Thomas's charity. So there was a kind of health dimension to this, looking at multiple long-term conditions, but really looking at new ways of service delivery with a social centre at the heart of it. I'm not going to say more because time is tight, but we'll circle back to it a little bit. During COVID, we scaled pretty quickly to become one of Suffolk's 8 community food hubs, delivering emergency food. Our model was based entirely on cycle couriers, which worked really well for us actually at a period where people were really keen to sort of get involved. So during the peak, which I think for us was June, we were delivering 7 tons a week, 850 individual food parcels a week, which we estimate was feeding about 1,700 people. We're still doing 4.5 tons a week, 568 deliveries. So those volunteers who we thought would go back to work, a lot were furloughed, etc., have really stuck with this. So yeah, I mean, I was surprised putting this together, but yeah, we're now at sort of 27,000 volunteer hours, 30,000 parcels, 96,000 kilometres travelled on bike. And there's something very much about capturing that, that incredible community effort, which is driving this work at the moment for us. Excuse me, my slides aren't advancing. Yeah. And part of the reason we were able to scale so much was some of the relationship building that had been in place prior to COVID through an organisation called the Walworth Group. And the Walworth Group was really intent to come together at a neighbourhood level, and I'll explain what I mean by a neighbourhood level in a second, to work collectively on issues. So these are some of the organisations that we're working with. And it's driven, this kind of new approach is driven very much by a lot of conversations, particularly during the summer and public events with, food parcel recipients, volunteers, partner organisations, funders, to talk about trying to tackle some of the long-term solutions of this. Because we knew, I mean, for us, prior to COVID, food was a way to bring people together. We weren't a food bank before, and we don't think, I don't need to go into that. I'm sure a lot of everyone on the call is kind of aware of all these issues. Just wanted to situate it briefly within the sort of borough framework. So Suffolk Food Action Plan in 2019, Suffolk worked with Sustain to build this. I think Sam from Suffolk is on the call. And we have the Suffolk Food Action Alliance, which is a network of kind of people working with food within Suffolk. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, kind of the link between the borough-wide and the neighbourhood working in a second. So this Walworth neighbourhood food model is just really very much at the start of this piece of work. It's partly about trying to form a vision to take some of the dynamism and the kind of effective partnership working that happened during COVID into the next phase. Struggling a bit with, there you go. So, I've sort of described this a bit already, but prior to COVID, we had this kind of emerging partnership. We had some key sites like the Walworth Living Room that were looking at different ways of building personal connections, more focused on that than service delivery, and testing new service models. And then what was for us a very, very effective sort of council and voluntary sector partnership working at a local level. But maybe perhaps a concern now that as the focus shifts, as sort of, that there was such clarity about the purpose of what needed doing during that period. How do we keep some of that kind of vision and keep some of that kind of collective work going? This is what we like to call the neighbourhood funnel, which just kind of helps us to think about how the relationship between kind of regional and national policy and framework guidance, borough-wide level strategy and thinking, and I mentioned some of the things there already. The Community Support Alliance is the sort of the work that's being done to evolve those community food hubs into a different kind of community alliance at the borough-wide level. But we at Pembroke House are particularly interested in this neighbourhood focus, which for us is a population of about 45,000 residents. So it's the 3 wards of North Walworth, Faraday and Newington. This is just south of the Elephant and Castle in London. We have the Old Kent Road going down the side, but there's sort of a lot of development there. So we're very sort of impacted by new development, but situate within kind of quite a much more long-standing community. You also have the Aylesbury redevelopment, which one of the partner organisations is working on, but very much with this kind of traditional high street, Walworth Road coming through the centre, and East Street Market, which I've indicated here, which we see as playing a sort of increasingly important role within the neighbourhood, and a lot of interest in new kind of projects and ways of doing things coming out of the kind of food bank to sort of pantry models, food co-ops, community kitchens, a lot of things that I'm sure will be familiar to people. But we're certainly trying to have a more sort of zoomed out view and look at assets within the community, supply chains, and finance and data in particular. I think there's a really, probably for another time, but we're doing a lot of thinking about how neighbourhood data is really important to this work and how we can actually track how this is done. But yeah, a dizzying amount of things to kind of plug into this thinking, and a lot of great work being done here. So for us, just to make a start, we're thinking in terms initially of several key sites where that are sort of available for partnership working and trialing new ways of working. So Walworth Living Room I mentioned already. That's somewhere where there's a sort of community cafe and some support services based around a kind of community setting. The Aylesbury Kitchen, who Notting Hill Genesis are, they have a crowdfunder out for at the moment, that's in motion, is really to capture or offer opportunities for some of the cooking groups, local chefs, food startups, a lot of seen so much interest, so much more awareness, I think, during COVID, that organizations who aren't necessarily on the face of it working with food are really, really dependent on kitchens for their work. Nurseries, for example, realized, some of the nurseries have backup arrangements with other organizations because the food provision is so critical to their working. And then what we found at Walworth Living Room was the number of groups who were coming and asking to use the kitchens for emerging startup enterprise kind of ideas. And then the front room is probably least advanced of all of these, but it's really the focus there is the fact that we know that the volunteer body that we had, a lot of younger people involved as couriers. More than 25% of them lost their job during COVID while volunteering for us, because they were in, hospitality industry, 0 hours contracts, etc. So we're really sort of keen to focus on a more sort of, local job provision, employment, and working with some of the skills that they already have on developing more social enterprise models within the catering industry. And I think we've situated up there in the north of the borough. There was potential for this to go into Elephant Park, to engage with some of the newer residents and crucially see this sort of circulation of people and finance between some of the areas kind of within the neighbourhood. And of course, sorry, I've run over time. So this is my very last point. East Street Market, who we played an increasing role in supply for a lot of the food provision during COVID for us. So we've worked with traders there to supply fresh fruit and veg, and of course, voucher schemes situated around that as well. But I think I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Richard. That's really interesting. And there's some questions in the chat box, which I think maybe sort of have a start of answering there. We can always bring them in the Q&A shortly. I'd like to just bring in Guy. Guy McQueen is the Regeneration Project Manager at Lewes District and Eastbourne Borough Councils, with a keen interest in sustainable food related projects. And Guy has been involved in the Young Professionals Board, advising on the Towns Fund, focusing on sustainability, and is here to provide some top tips on engaging with the funding and weaving in the sustainable food agenda. Guy.
Hello. Thank you. I think I've got an easier job in some ways, as I'm talking more broadly than very dense, heavily involved projects and organisations as you. So I'm taking a bit of a different tack in some ways. I want to talk about two things specifically, and just before that, just a bit of background. So New Haven has been the focus for Lewes in so many ways and for so much funding. So I would say a bit of good news in some ways. We are currently focused on developing bids for the local Levelling Up Fund, particularly around food. So I'm hoping that's happening in other areas, but this is at the moment the biggest focus. But so just a bit of news there. Now I want to talk about, I think about biomimicry a lot, and I think about how we can start with nature in that respect. Now, if you see there some different types of symbiotic relationships. Now, let me put it this way. How do we think perhaps community groups are viewed by officers, councillors? How are those relationships working? Now, mutualism is a plus there, so it's good for everyone. Now, I'm not suggesting there's any sort of view of from officers or councillors as community groups as parasites, but I like to think, how is that email looking when it comes, how are these emails and these bids and these suggestions coming through? Ideally, anything that is working together in any relationship is mutually beneficial. So let me just, good. So I don't know what you think when you see the crocodile and the bird here, but I like to think that in a positive way, particularly officers, what we want to do is, I don't think there's any negativity within officers in terms of doing good things in the community and that they care about food, and it will vary upon each authority. But and I'm not suggesting that the government are the crocodile, but if you look at this example, the bird has worked out a way to benefit from cleaning the teeth, and the crocodile has decided that it wants the bird to clean its teeth. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. What I'm trying to say is, if food groups want to get funding, the best way to do it is to look as a plus and to understand what the needs of government are and what the needs of the funds are. So yes, happy to come back to that shortly. The other thing that I want to think about is background induction, which is part of game theory. Now, essentially, what we tend to do, I think we all understand, you can see the definition on the board, and you understand it's working backwards effectively. We all know when we have to do this in certain thinking when we play games. What tends to happen, funding gets announced from seemingly from nowhere, from government sometimes. Lots of ideas, not necessarily always completely, some great ideas, but what we often get is a lot of suggestions for projects that don't necessarily meet the criteria or haven't been worked up. Then you get this mad scramble, which we're usually in. I'm not suggesting this is mad scramble time, but these funds have been bid and we're now scrambling to find out how we can understand them and work up bids. And then local authority obviously submit the bid and government assess it. I really like to try and work, if I can, and this might seem over the top, but really it's working backwards. So we have to understand the final assessment and the bid submission and work backwards. And preferably, there's as much preparation as possible in advance. This is the whole idea of oven ready projects. So what we always have to focus on is the outputs. It's always the thing. Okay, great project, great idea. Well, what are the outputs? How are we going to measure it? How are we going to evidence the fact that this is a great thing? And I know Richard talked about some of that, and some of this strategizing will get that, and it's building that evidence base. I do think that there is some scope for I mean, the community fund is obviously quite an exciting prospect when we know what's going on. I do think, for instance, that things can be worked in. So can food be put into a bid? I mean, I'm trying to get that looked at within one of our authorities, which isn't necessarily based around food, but it's the land use, and can we add that in? So it says this, and can there be this symbiotic relationship between different sectors? It's something to consider. And again, part of land use, there's a lot of unused land, helping the authority, because authorities want to have good use of land, and they don't always keep good track of their land, frankly. And so understanding the strategy of how we can use land and giving them something, saying, look, we can help you with this. We're gonna help you with this land and preferably generate some revenue. So they're my sort of general musings on how to work it through. And just to understand that we will eventually be ending, well, effectively, we tend to work from the Green Book mostly, and trying to get in the mindset of what we have to face, because it's so easy to come up with great ideas and for this process to be that linear process I showed you, but trying to work out and get in the mindset and understand what has to be evidence would be my massive tip, as hard as it is to get to grips with Green Book. I've been on a 6-hour presentation on it and watched it twice, and it's still understanding what you have to do. But problems, what problem are you trying to solve? What are the options? Evidence. Basically, how can we prove that this is going to work? Getting the right relationships with councillors, with officers, with different community groups, working together. And don't be afraid to, if you've been working on something for a long time, I don't think always we have to hold on to these pet projects that aren't working. Work out why they're not working and have a think again. So that's my speedy presentation for you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you ever so much. Really, really interesting, inspiring sort of overview, I think. We've got quite a few questions, some which are very focused, some which are, I suppose, really warrant sort of slightly longer responses from everybody. Just a quick point on clarification that's come in, Guy, around from Maddie Longhurst. What's Green Book?
Green Book, Magenta Book, it's the government's criteria for any application to be assessed. So, and we have to work by Green Book criteria for showing business cases. So they have made some more allowance for those not as easy to measure things, like the outputs, which aren't just jobs. I mean, it has always tended to focus on jobs, square footage, how much money you're going to make from that square footage can be quite linear, but you have to work through. Basically, it's a means of testing your business case. So it might well be, and you apply sort of how you work out how your optimism bias is going to be. Okay, it's really dry stuff to read in some ways, but in some ways the things they've changed they haven't really caught up with. They want to include some of these measurements that aren't clear, right? And we all know that it's harder in some ways to show some of the community outputs compared to jobs and square footage. So it will catch you up, but yeah, so that's what Green Book is. I'm happy to try and send over something that's a nice, easy explanation of it.
Thank you, Guy. And I'd like to come back to you in a second, as there's another question that's coming from Iain Chambers. It'd be good to get a response to that. Just one other sort of clarification, actually, for Richard. There's a question from Shalene, who's asking a question on workings behind a particular figure. Shalene, are you happy to unmute? Because I think it related to a particular slide. And I just wondered if you wanted to
Sure, Ben.
do a better job.
It's basically there was a beautiful image and the total amount of funding that the community spent on food. I just out of interest, how did I don't know if I missed that.
Oh, no, you're right. It's a very crude calculation based on national household spend on food multiplied by the population. So it hasn't been tweaked for our specific neighbourhood.
Oh, right. I thought it might have been.
Yeah, no, afraid not. No. Would like that kind of information, but
okay. Well, it's a really inspiring project, and we hope to do something in East Birmingham. So I might drop you an email. And we're also trying to get more local data about food consumption and choices people are making. So because national data isn't too representative, so that was it. That was why I asked the question. But thank you.
Thank you, Shalene.
Be very happy to. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. It's great to see good ideas spread, hopefully. Another question I'd like to bring in, Power to Change. I think, Jenny, Susie had to leave, so this is probably for you. There was a question from David Garlick about, does Power to Change have any links with the NFU?
No, we don't, actually. Sorry, at the moment, yeah.
Is that something that... I mean, this is maybe more a question for David around the potential, whether there be potential interest in something like a community-owned or community interest model within. I mean, clearly there's interest within farming circles. I suppose the question is whether there's interest within the NFU. David, did you want to sort of come in quickly, maybe sort of on a rationale of why you asked the question and whether you see any potential links? I think David might have had to leave us. In which case, I might actually, whilst I've got you here, I had a couple other questions about Power to Change. I just wonder if you've seen a growth of desire to set up community businesses in response to COVID. And I suppose sort of secondly, sort of a couple other questions, not necessarily related. Do you think there's an ideal number of community businesses in an area? Is there, can you have too many? Or are there too few? Is there a sort of threshold that you get above within an area and it reaps many, many more benefits? And I'm just wondering if there's any locations you think that have really embraced this sort of community enterprise model.
Yeah. Sure, really interesting questions, Ben, both of them. I mean, certainly in response to what's happened during COVID, the community businesses, the sector as a whole, some of them have seen their trading go right up, and food businesses, a lot of those food businesses have been amongst those, and then some of them have seen their activities completely having to be put on hold, for example, the arts sector and those sorts of things. No, but so for example, community food businesses, I think certain types of community food businesses have seen their trading really go through the roof. Like, for example, veggie box schemes, clearly there's been an absolutely exponential increase in demand for those, and a lot of veggie box schemes have had to cap the new customers they take on. I mean, I'm thinking about Regather in Sheffield, and I also know a number of others that really have had such a huge increase in orders and have made had a big opportunity to kind of think, right, well, what next then? Where do we need investment in order to support this? So that's something that has definitely been really noticeable is with box delivery schemes. And then the other one I think is food delivery schemes. I mean, Edible London Kick are sort of quite a good example of that, an organisation that started off very, very small scale and was a fairly new starting organisation. I think it just started a couple of years before COVID and was operating at a very small scale, and as you know, Ben, just increased very, very quickly with the demand for delivery of food across the city, and took on sort of a number of food delivery contracts from local authorities. So yeah, lots of different types of community food businesses. I mean, the one I mentioned, Falmouth Food Co-op, meals delivery has absolutely increased very much. And so that's another area where where community food businesses are seeing a real expansion. So I think compared to other sectors, certainly food has really come to the fore during COVID, and access to food has become more intense for people. All those community needs have become more intense. In terms of a threshold for, is there an ideal number of community food businesses in a given area? I mean, that research I don't know of. I don't know of research that exists which has explored that question. But I mean, certainly, it would be interesting to look at what's the optimum number of community businesses in a village. How many what services do people need in a village, and what's the best community-based model of providing those services? And ask the same question for a town, and ask the same question for a city. I mean, that's research that it would be really useful to do, and lots and lots of different services can be provided under a community model. Certainly would like to see lots more being done under the community-based model, just because there's so many extra well-being, health, community cohesion benefits, but no, I don't have that research.
Thanks, Jenny. That's really, really fascinating, and something that would be interesting to explore in future, hopefully. We had a question that's come in from Iain Chambers that I'd like to bring all the panel, all the speakers on to some comment on, which is a question of, I suppose, engagement with local authorities, particularly, I think, when you're coming at this from an enterprise point of view or community point of view. So Iain said an ongoing challenge seems to be how a community organisation can engage with local authorities, which are quite siloed, where you've got property and finance department thinking about income, other departments looking at outcomes and services. Guy, I was wondering if you might be able to kick off on any advice that you would give on how one goes about, I suppose, breaking through those silos. And yeah, I'd like to hear from others as well.
Yeah, of course. I would say I've only been local government for 2 years, and Lewes and Eastbourne, I would say, are pretty solid in the way that they work compared to perhaps. I mean, I can't say it's perfect. You're right, the communication between and the competing demands. I would say that that councillors perhaps are the way in more so, which might be difficult in some authorities, but we are officers. We do not make decisions. We have to present evidence and then have those decisions decided democratically. So I think the best way is to look at those crocodiles and work out what they need to justify it. I mean, Iain, were you talking about specifically the departments, not the councillors, or do you think I've missed what you're trying to express there?
No, I think it's just, I guess, if you're a small organisation and perhaps a new organisation, and lots of community businesses are quite new, it's perhaps just advice on learning the way in. The Bevy definitely have pretty much cultivated our councillors. I mean, they supported us, but we made sure that we also supported them and hold surgeries and things like that. In Brighton, it's useful in terms of food. It's useful that we have a food partnership who closely linked with the council, so that helps those with food. But we do tend to sometimes come up against this kind of things rubbing up against each other, and it can be quite difficult to talk to one person who's kind of can be across. Even councillors themselves, or part-time and busy people, can't always get across all of the issues and all of the tension. So it's just that way to approach.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's shocking how much people don't necessarily understand the value of farming, or understand. Oh, sorry, not just farming, but that's the thing that cropped to mind. But it is that if you can lay on a plate in a really succinct manner what the value of whatever you're trying to present as a problem and a solution, you are. They do. All councillors and officers are sometimes knowledge poor. They don't understand it. I was chatting to a small scale farmer who's just set up and who's a friend, fortunately, and so it's you know, as in I'm just gathering, trying to learn more, and she's looking at very small scale farming, and I'm understanding a great deal from that, and the value of and the need for looking at how the land is used regeneratively and on a smaller scale for more productivity. Now, productivity, if you can show them that you're going to get good productive use, and I know you're saying there's income and then there's other aspects, but you know, food is income. Food is 1 in 7 jobs. I mean, this is not people don't necessarily understand the economic aspect of food, and maybe that is still the way in. Maybe it has to be still, but showing those wider benefits. But it's tricky. It's tricky, and it sometimes takes time, I think.
Thank you, Guy. I think that's a really good point, and I think it's one of the reasons why we felt the need within Sustainable Food Places and Sustain to focus on this sort of this question of economy, because it's going to be so crucial over the coming years. And I think what many of the examples we've heard from today and many others within the movement, if I can call it that, it's articulating both the economic benefits, the employment benefits, but also those added benefits as well, environmental and social benefits, which chime with so many different current agendas. But it's still a challenge to do it in a really succinct way. And I think we really find the evidence that's going to convince those people to look beyond just a narrow focus. I was just wondering, Richard, on this sort of question of councils working in silos, have you, is that something that you've experienced? Is that something that you found a way to overcome those and to actually, I suppose, foster maybe more sort of cross-departmental thinking within the local authority, or have you managed to avoid that altogether?
Yeah, I think, I mean, for us, that Walworth group that I mentioned was a way to do that, and that Walworth group tries to work across a massive amount of different areas. So from, you know, planning, data, food, you know, and it's sort of, I think a lot of the organizations involved in that feel like, God, this takes a lot of resource. And of course, that's one of the big challenges. If you're a bigger organization, you have the resource and the time to engage on those kind of issues. And one of the things we're trying to do in our partnership now is work out how we can support smaller groups to have the time and the resource to engage. But the sort of the crocodile bird for us, I guess, was, you know, the council had said it wanted to produce social regen charters for each of the neighbourhood areas within Southwark. Probably wouldn't have been what we chose to spend our time working on within that group, but we knew it was important for them, and then that helps to kind of build trust and understanding. I mean, I think the big challenge for us at the moment with the council, and you know, maybe this I can sort of partly take Vera's question here as well about how you define the neighbourhood. I think the council are keen to work. You know, keen to support this work that we're doing, but of course they have the issue of needing to work across the borough. So how can they justify, you know, investing more or sort of really getting behind a project that doesn't claim to be borough wide? And one of the ways that I mean, the reason we would argue why that's important is because you can work much more nimbly and much more quickly to do some testing that then becomes applied in other areas. So it's really embedding that sort of sharing of what's done as part of the really, really core bit of the work. But also for us trying to look for another neighbourhood in a different area that feels a little bit different, that might have a different population size, and, you know, work out what from our approach carries across to another neighbourhood and what doesn't. Because I think, you know, yeah, for us, it's really important that it does have application elsewhere, and not all neighbourhoods are the same, but we can learn from each other.
Thanks, Richard. I think that's a really good note to end on. We can learn from each other. I'm really, really sorry that we're going to have to wrap up here. We did have to add in an extra 15 minutes because we had so many speakers and so much to get through. There's some great comments in the chat box that I'd love for us to cover. We just don't have time. You know, the role of community food enterprises in 20-minute neighbourhoods. Maybe this is one that we can return to in a future session. I think there's some real mileage in that. We have packed in a lot today. There's lots of opportunities at the moment, some more imminent than others. I know the team here, particularly Ren, would love to hear from you on what sessions, what support you'd find useful on this agenda in future, particularly with some of these deadlines coming up. Do ping us emails if there's barriers that you're facing with great ideas that you want to be working on, or whether, and let us know if you're putting in bids and you're getting some mileage. I think, we'd love to hear about some of the success stories that we can share throughout the network. And yeah, we'd like to hear about what more you think we should be doing on this in future. We've really just scratched the surface, I think, today on those opportunities and some of those sort of good food enterprise models. So this leaves me to thank all the speakers, particularly thank Ren and the organisers for this session, and hope to see you all soon in similar forums. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Ben.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.